Emily Walton had never known the comfort of luxury or the quiet hum of generational ease. Her world began on the cracked pavements of Milton Street, where her childhood was colored with the scent of shoe polish and worn leather scraps. Her father, Gregory Walton, a quiet cobbler with arthritic fingers and a soft voice, had run a small repair shed in their backyard, stitching dignity into the shoes of forgotten men. Emily, his shadow, absorbed his craft like breath. When cancer took him away at 13, her mother, Yvette Walton, folded into herself, grief hardening her expressions into cold silence. Yvette loved Emily, but not in words or warmth, only in actions, silent dinners, folded laundry, and the occasional reprimand for dreaming too loudly. Emily grew up with more resilience than reassurance, turning her father's cobbler bench into her sacred space, where she began designing shoes by candlelight while her peers scrolled phones in heated homes. Despite the weight of struggle, Emily's spirit remained intact, defiant, and determined. She refused to be swallowed by the cycle that kept so many in Milton Street running in place. At 22, with no college degree and a toddler to feed, she converted her father's old tool shed into a compact workshop. Her tools were modest: wooden shoe lasts, basic cutting knives, and a sewing machine inherited from an old family friend. But her imagination was endless. She stitched emotions into every sole, carving stories into her leatherwork, custom-fit designs that caught the attention of locals and later, tourists passing through town. Her son, Lucas, only 6, often curled in a sleeping bag beside her workbench, watching her trace patterns on cardboard before transferring them to goat hide. Her first commission came from a retired bus driver named Mr. Cohen, who was moved to tears when she returned his dead wife's handbag as a pair of memorial shoes. Word spread, and slowly, Emily became the unknown whisper behind some of the town's most heartfelt handmade crafts. Yet for all her talent and strength, Emily's kindness remained her rarest virtue. On Saturdays, she volunteered at the nursing home around the corner, helping seniors with shoe fittings or polishing wheelchairs. She never charged them. She also taught 3 underprivileged girls from the block, Zoe, Mabel, and Lina, the basics of shoe measuring, not for profit, but for purpose. Still, the weight of life was not light. Bills piled like bricks. Lucas's school fees were always a week too early. And Yvette's health had begun to fade, though the woman never admitted weakness. Emily bore it all, silently. She believed if she stitched hard enough, prayed quietly enough, and loved deeply enough, the world would one day open a door. But she never imagined that door would swing wide through a man named Nathaniel Rivers, a man from a world so far from Milton Street, it might as well have been the moon. Nathaniel Rivers, known to most as Nate, was the kind of man who wore success like cologne, sharp, lingering, and impossible to ignore. Born in the suburban hills of Fairfax, Virginia, Nate was raised in a 5-bedroom, oak-trimmed house that echoed wealth, but not warmth. His father, Vincent Rivers Sr., was a titan in real estate development until a sudden heart attack left 12-year-old Nate as the sole heir to the family name. His mother, Eleanor Rivers, never remarried. She became colder after her husband's death, turning her grief into grooming Nate for legacy. From an early age, Nate was taught how to project charm, close deals, and never cry. Prep school turned him into a polished speaker, college shaped him into a shark, and by 30, he was vice president at Halston and Bryce Properties, a powerful firm with properties sprawled across the East Coast. But buried beneath Nate's crisp suits and closed-door meetings was a young man whose emotional compass had long been muted. Nate never truly mourned his father, he compartmentalized it. Loss, to him, was something you boxed up and shelved. During his college years at Cornell, he dated women with Ivy League degrees and picture-perfect smiles, but never let anyone too close. That changed, temporarily, with a woman named Selena Marks, an ambitious business major with a fire that briefly challenged his walls. They were together for a year until she chose a Wall Street position in London over a future with him. That rejection hardened Nate further, sharpening his resolve to become untouchable. By the time he turned 33, his focus narrowed solely to power, prestige, and perfecting the Rivers name. He worked 18-hour days, hosted networking galas, and obsessed over quarterly profits. He believed love could wait. Legacy could not. Yet, somewhere in his neatly arranged life, a quiet emptiness festered, one he silenced with champagne toasts and silent nights alone in his penthouse. Nate didn't know he was lonely. He just called it discipline. Eleanor, however, noticed. She'd never recovered from losing her husband, and though she never said it, she mourned her own emotional decay. But her ambitions were now embedded in Nate. She attended every fundraiser he hosted, introduced him to senators' daughters, and encouraged him to date someone refined enough for his class. Her favorite candidate? Vanessa Hale, the daughter of a federal judge and a junior partner at a prestigious legal firm. Vanessa was tall, intelligent, and charming, everything Eleanor thought a Rivers woman should be. Nate entertained the idea briefly, attending a few formal events with Vanessa for optics, but felt no connection beyond conversation. Still, he didn't question his mother's presence in his life, it was all he knew. What he didn't know was that a quiet, fierce soul named Emily Walton, who had never stepped foot inside a yacht or attended a gala, was about to disrupt everything he thought he wanted. And it would all begin with trash bags, civic duty, and a stubborn pair of muddy work boots. It was a blustery Saturday morning when the Milton Civic Cleanup Initiative launched its citywide beautification drive, an annual event mostly ignored by elites, but this year was different. Halston and Bryce Properties had been mandated to sponsor part of the campaign in order to secure zoning approvals for a multi-complex deal. Nate, being the face of the firm's negotiations, had no choice but to attend. He arrived in tailored trousers and designer loafers, his assistant trailing behind with an itinerary clipped to a leather folder. The city lot designated for him was none other than Milton Street, ironically the very place his firm planned to demolish for new condos. He expected handshakes and press photos. What he didn't expect was to find a woman on her knees scrubbing graffiti off a wall with the ferocity of a soldier. Emily Walton, sun-kissed, sweat-beaded, and clad in denim overalls, looked up, their eyes meeting like a sharp exhale between strangers who somehow recognized each other's pain. Emily had no idea who Nate Rivers was. She didn't care either. All she saw was a polished, well-dressed man surrounded by cameras and people too clean to care about the streets they claimed to save. She continued her scrubbing, refusing to smile or flatter. Nate, mildly intrigued, made an offhand comment about how community work should be delegated, not endured. Emily stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and replied, "People who delegate lives don't understand what it costs to live one." The air cracked with her words. It wasn't just the defiance, it was the quiet hurt beneath it. Most people either groveled in Nate's presence or tried to impress him. Emily did neither. That fascinated him. He spent more time than necessary watching her assign tasks to teens, climb ladders, carry boxes, and joke with an old man named Mr. Tobias who'd brought free lemonade for the volunteers. It wasn't her beauty that shook Nate, it was her substance. Her presence. After the event, as the crowd dispersed and the mayor shook hands with executives, Nate caught Emily alone, loading trash bags into a truck. "You always clean other people's messes?" he asked, expecting sarcasm in return. Instead, she glanced over and said, "Only when they leave it for kids to walk through." Nate found himself chuckling, genuinely. She introduced herself. He extended his hand, intrigued. But Emily didn't give hers back, she handed him a garbage bag instead. "Since you're here for the cameras, might as well act like it." The moment burned into Nate's mind long after he returned to his penthouse. He Googled her that night. No social media. No website. Just a local blog post about handmade shoes made by a single mother on Milton Street. Something shifted in him, a curiosity he couldn't shake. And Emily? She didn't think twice about him. Not yet. Nate didn't return to Milton Street for 2 weeks, but Emily remained a steady hum in the back of his mind, a woman too grounded for his world and yet too compelling to ignore. On the 3rd week, he drove by her shed workshop under the guise of property scouting, only to find her sewing leather straps by lamplight, Lucas dozing off beside her. He didn't approach. He watched. And something softened in him, a restlessness he hadn't felt since his early 20s. Eventually, he did return, under the pretense of donating leftover office furniture. Emily raised a brow but accepted it with minimal words. What began as casual drop-ins soon became coffee runs, and soon after that, long conversations over takeout on paint buckets. She'd tell him about her dreams of starting a full-service footwear brand and hiring other women like herself. He listened, not as a businessman, but as a man who, for the first time in years, wanted to stay. Their connection unfolded like the lacing of a boot, slow, deliberate, intimate. Emily, at first skeptical, found herself trusting Nate more with every visit. He never judged her for her humble living, and though he rarely spoke of himself, she noticed how his eyes softened whenever Lucas called him Mr. Nate. They spent weeks getting to know each other, not over caviar or champagne, but over paint-stained jeans, broken zippers, and city noise. He helped her fix a broken workbench one Saturday, and when she saw him struggle with the screwdriver, she laughed until her cheeks hurt. It was the first time she had laughed like that in years. Nate confessed that same evening that he hadn't felt more like himself in a long time. He kissed her then, gently, cautiously, like a man unsure he deserved the warmth she gave so freely. Emily didn't pull away. She leaned in. In her world of broken things, he was the most polished surprise. 6 months later, during an intimate dinner hosted at Carlos and Savannah's backyard, with string lights glowing overhead and Lucas fast asleep inside, Nate stood up and gave a small, nervous toast. He spoke not of earnings or buildings, but of finding something worth more than legacy, something he never believed existed for him. Emily stared, confused, until he knelt beside her, pulled out a simple silver ring, and asked, "Let me build a life, not just a name." "With you." Her breath caught, and for once, the girl from Milton Street couldn't speak. Savannah screamed first. Carlos clapped next. And Emily nodded through misty eyes. "Only if you keep fixing my broken shelves," she whispered, laughing through tears. Unbeknownst to her, a shadow watched from a distance, Eleanor Rivers, leaning against her black sedan, her arms folded and lips drawn into a bitter line. The proposal was sweet, but Eleanor's disapproval had only just begun to bloom. The Rivers estate was everything Emily had never wanted, vast, silent, and cold in a way no fireplace could warm. The moment she stepped across the threshold with Nate's arm around her and Lucas's small hand clasped in hers, a chill settled on her spine that had nothing to do with the air. The walls were adorned with antique mirrors and oil portraits of people who looked like they never smiled. Eleanor Rivers greeted them in the foyer with a tight-lipped smile and a gaze that skipped right past Emily to land on Nate. "You're late," she said, voice stiff as crystal. "I wasn't expecting children." Nate responded with a gentle warning tone, but it bounced off Eleanor like light off glass. Emily extended a polite greeting and received a firm nod in return. The maid, Jules, a woman in her late 40s with a soft face and nervous hands, whispered a warm welcome when no one was looking. Emily smiled, but deep down, she felt displaced already. Eleanor's distaste wasn't loud, it was laced in subtle gestures. When Emily served tea in the wrong cups, she received a pointed stare. When Lucas trailed crumbs on the pristine marble floors, Eleanor simply handed a napkin with an arched brow. But worse than the condescension was her whispered comments behind closed doors, which Emily overheard one night from the hallway. "A woman with calluses shouldn't bear the Rivers name." Nate tried to mediate, brushing it off as generational differences. He'd kiss Emily's forehead and tell her to ignore it, that Eleanor would come around. But Emily could feel the tension tightening like thread beneath her skin. She wasn't ashamed of who she was or where she came from. She just didn't know how to fight a war that was waged in silent nods, clenched jaws, and social chess moves she never learned. She found comfort in Jules, who confided that Eleanor had once driven away another woman Nate loved, quietly, deliberately, and without ever lifting a finger. While Nate juggled boardroom deals and expansion meetings, Emily tried to keep the household from feeling like a war zone. She turned a spare guest room into a modest workshop, working quietly as Lucas played beside her, unaware of the undercurrent of disdain that filled the halls. On weekends, she invited Carlos and Savannah over, but Eleanor often made excuses for why they couldn't stay long. Emily began to notice how Nate sometimes adjusted her words when retelling stories at events, softening her dialect, skipping over her job title. The deeper they moved into the river's lifestyle, the more Emily felt herself being reshaped like one of her leather molds, bent, stretched, sanded to fit. But she didn't bend easily. She stitched her days with resilience, watching Eleanor closely and silently building a plan. She wouldn't lose herself in this house. And she wouldn't let Lucas grow up thinking love meant being tolerated instead of treasured. Emily first met Vanessa Hale during a private networking mixer. Nate insisted they attend together, a formal gathering hosted by Halston and Bryce. The event took place inside a lavish ballroom surrounded by men in designer suits and women in dresses that whispered wealth with every step. Emily wore a cream-colored dress she made herself, hand-stitched and elegant in its simplicity. She caught several eyes for her beauty, but Vanessa's stare was different. It was sharp, measured, and coldly amused. Tall, poised, and polished to the bone, Vanessa carried the air of someone who had never been told no. She approached with champagne in hand and greeted Nate with a hug that lingered far too long. "So, this is Emily," she said smoothly, her smile never touching her eyes. "I've heard things." Emily extended her hand, unbothered, but Vanessa didn't shake it. Instead, she turned back to Nate, recalling old stories from college as if Emily didn't exist at all. The tension between the two women crackled beneath every interaction that followed. Emily noticed how Vanessa often appeared uninvited, dropping by Nate's office, texting him late under the guise of project deadlines, and offering professional advice that conveniently excluded Emily. Nate, either oblivious or pretending to be, always brushed it off. "She's an old friend," he'd say. But to Emily, it felt more like a ghost from a chapter that refused to close. Back at the estate, Eleanor, already weary of Emily's presence, took to entertaining Vanessa during tea hours. They shared quiet laughs, exchanged knowing glances, and spoke in polished undertones whenever Emily entered the room. It wasn't long before Eleanor began suggesting things like etiquette lessons, new wardrobes, and refinement courses, all under the pretext of helping Emily adjust to her new life. Emily listened politely, but each suggestion chipped away at her spirit, leaving her feeling like an outsider dressed in borrowed dignity. Then came a much-needed visit from Carlos and his spirited wife, Savannah, a burst of color in Emily's increasingly gray world. They brought laughter, warmth, and stories from Milton Street, grounding Emily back into who she truly was. But the moment Carlos playfully hugged Emily in the hallway, Vanessa, who had just arrived to drop off paperwork, caught a glimpse and raised a perfectly arched brow. That night, during dinner, Eleanor casually asked Nate if it bothered him that his fiancée spent so much time with the mechanic. Nate laughed it off, but Emily's heart tightened. The walls were closing in, not through confrontation, but through manipulation. A house where eyes judged, words twisted, and allies were rare. As Emily walked Lucas to bed later that evening, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "I won't let this place change me." But deep down, she knew something was coming. A storm. One that would either make her or destroy everything she'd ever known. By the start of fall, Emily found herself walking a tightrope strung between survival and self-erasure. The Rivers estate had become a gallery of glances and whispers, every hallway a corridor of judgment. While Nate remained buried in real estate contracts and investment meetings, Emily struggled to juggle the growing pressure of high society expectations with the duties of motherhood and the aching need to keep her identity intact. Eleanor continued her passive war, never raising her voice but always making her disdain felt. Lucas had begun having nightmares and wetting the bed, something Emily kept to herself. The once vibrant boy was now quieter, drawing pictures of houses with no people inside them. Emily still took leathercraft commissions in secret, selling custom pieces to local shop owners under a pseudonym. She couldn't explain it, but creating shoes, touching raw materials with her bare hands, was the only thing anchoring her in this life that increasingly didn't feel like hers. Meanwhile, Nate's long hours at work turned into longer nights away from home. He claimed it was a crucial period at the firm, new clients, shifting markets, government approvals, but Emily began noticing how quickly his demeanor shifted when he mentioned Vanessa. He had started wearing cologne again, the one he only used for major gala nights. His phone was always on silent now, flipped screen down, and his temper, once gentle, had begun to snap like brittle twigs. "You're too sensitive," he told Emily one night when she asked if Vanessa really needed to text him at midnight about a land appraisal. "It's business, Emily. You wouldn't understand." That sentence struck deeper than he realized. Emily had built everything she had from nothing, but somehow, her struggles didn't seem to count in this polished world. She turned to Jules, who noticed too much and said too little. Jules warned her gently, "Some women come with smiles like silk but hands like knives." One afternoon, Eleanor accused Lucas of stealing one of her pearl hair clips. Emily found it days later under a rug, clearly dropped. But the accusation lingered in the air like poison. Nate didn't defend his son. Instead, he asked Emily to keep better watch. That night, Emily sat on the floor of her closet, sewing a pair of custom baby shoes for a customer back in Milton Street, tears falling silently onto the leather. She missed the girl who once laughed in paint-streaked overalls, who made magic out of scraps. Her own voice now sounded foreign in the grand halls of the Rivers mansion. The silence between her and Nate grew heavier with each passing day, like furniture she couldn't rearrange. Vanessa's presence loomed larger, Eleanor's glares sharper. Emily didn't have proof, but she felt it. Something was breaking. And whatever it was, it wouldn't shatter gently. The crack came on a Sunday morning dressed as a brunch invitation. Eleanor had orchestrated an elaborate gathering, inviting members of her elite social circle under the guise of formally introducing Emily to the women who matter. Emily, sensing a trap but unable to refuse, wore a rust-toned dress she stitched herself, paired with leather flats from her handmade collection. She looked elegant, radiant even, but the air turned cold the moment she stepped into the solarium. The women, pillared wives of mayors, attorneys, and financiers, grinned with polite venom. Their questions were barbed with backhanded compliments. "You made those shoes yourself?" "That's so." "Quaint. How refreshing it must be to come from nothing." Eleanor didn't defend her daughter-in-law. Instead, she laughed delicately and said, "Emily has always had a charming resilience." Nate arrived midway, late and distracted, texting Vanessa beneath the table. Emily watched him, the burn in her chest growing with each glance he refused to meet. The moment that would fracture everything came after Lucas, craving a distraction, bumped into a waitress and spilled a tray of wine onto one of Eleanor's prized linen chairs. The room gasped. Emily rushed to help, but before she could reach him, Eleanor hissed through clenched teeth, "This is why children don't belong in certain spaces." The shame on Lucas's face was immediate, raw. Emily froze, caught between rage and heartbreak. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "He's a child. Not a stain." Eleanor, unfazed, looked to Nate for backup. And Nate, whose phone buzzed again with a message from Vanessa, "When are you free to talk alone?" sighed and said, "Emily, just take him upstairs. Please." That word, please, wasn't kindness. It was dismissal. Emily didn't argue. She led Lucas by the hand past the staring guests, her spine rigid with silent fury. Upstairs, as she cleaned his tear-streaked cheeks, she realized something was dying in her. And it wasn't love. It was trust. That night, Nate found her on the balcony, staring out over the shadowy garden with Lucas fast asleep inside. "You embarrassed her," he said flatly, as though Eleanor's cruelty had been an act of nobility. Emily didn't respond. She simply asked, "Is this what being part of your world costs?" Nate offered no apology, just another deflection. "We have a brand, Emily. A reputation." She turned to him, hurt flashing like lightning in her eyes. "So now I'm bad for your brand?" His silence confirmed it. The quiet war turned into something deeper, a chasm filled with resentment and unspoken truths. That night, Emily gathered a few of Lucas's clothes into a backpack and slept on the floor beside his bed. Downstairs, Eleanor praised Nate for maintaining order. And in another home, Vanessa poured herself wine and texted, "She'll never belong." And you know it. Nate read it, didn't reply. But the seed had been watered, and it would soon grow into something cruel. The Halston and Bryce Property Summit in Charlotte was meant to be a turning point in Nate's career. For weeks, Eleanor spoke of it as an opportunity for him to seal a billion-dollar waterfront contract that would elevate him into executive ranks. But for Nate, the summit represented something else entirely, a weekend of escape. Vanessa Hale had been assigned to co-lead the pitch alongside him, and the invitation came laced with unspoken intentions. Emily, already distant, didn't question his departure. She merely handed him his luggage with the same expression she now wore daily, unreadable. At the hotel, away from the heavy gaze of family and expectations, Vanessa dropped the professional mask. She wore a silk robe instead of her usual blazers, her perfume trailing like temptation. On the second night, after too many drinks and even more blurred lines, Nate kissed her. There was no resistance. What began as a drunken slip became a deliberate betrayal wrapped in hotel sheets and whispered lies. Back home, Emily tried to convince herself that the silence in her marriage wasn't infidelity, it was stress, pressure, circumstance. She threw herself deeper into her leathercraft, completing late-night orders for clients she'd gained from Carlos's referrals. She designed a new line of children's shoes, something inspired by Lucas's sketches of superhero boots, and sent out prototypes anonymously. Jules, ever observant, noticed the distant look in Emily's eyes and the way Nate had stopped kissing her goodbye in the mornings. "Be careful," she warned one evening as they folded laundry. "That house doesn't take kindly to strong women." Emily smiled weakly, brushing the comment aside. She didn't know what to be careful of anymore, Eleanor, Vanessa, or her own unraveling hope. Lucas began asking why Daddy was never home, and Emily lied, again and again, until her words tasted like dust. And across town, Vanessa tucked Nate's tie into her purse after another rendezvous and whispered, "You're wasting time going back there." When Nate returned, he came bearing excuses and guilt poorly disguised as fatigue. Emily watched him from the dining table, noting the new cufflinks and the different scent on his skin. He talked about presentations, deals, and late nights, but avoided eye contact when she asked how the hotel food was. That night, after Lucas went to sleep, Emily walked past their bedroom into the guest room, claiming she needed space. Nate didn't protest. He only nodded, as if some silent agreement had already been made. The next morning, Emily found a small lip gloss container wedged between the seats of Nate's car, cherry red, not her shade. She placed it on the kitchen counter without a word. Nate saw it. Still, he said nothing. Outside, it began to rain, a heavy, unrelenting storm. Emily stood at the window, arms folded, and whispered to herself, "So this is how betrayal enters. Without a knock, without a sound, and wearing your husband's suit." The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning, so ordinary it made the destruction feel surreal. Emily had just dropped Lucas off at school and returned home early to find Nate's car parked in the driveway, odd, considering he was supposed to be at a regional board meeting. She walked in quietly, passing the foyer where Eleanor's voice echoed faintly from the parlor. As she turned toward the kitchen, she froze. There, sitting on the island counter, was the same cherry red lip gloss, but now paired with a woman's silk scarf and a crumpled hotel receipt sticking out of Nate's briefcase. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. Room 714. Charlotte. Same summit dates. Same hotel. Vanessa had posted a picture from just a week ago. The realization didn't sink, it detonated. When Nate entered, startled to find her home, she held up the receipt and asked just one question, "Why her?" His mouth opened, but the truth stumbled behind cowardice. What followed was a storm not of raised voices, but of heartbreak sharpened by humiliation. Nate denied it at first, accusing her of snooping and paranoia. Emily, calm but seething, asked how many nights he spent betraying her while she stitched shoes to pay for Lucas's school lunch. Nate shouted then, throwing accusations of emotional neglect, calling her small-minded and limited. That word, limited, broke something sacred. Eleanor entered midway, her voice sharp as a blade, demanding to know what the chaos was about. When Emily explained, Eleanor gasped, not in shock at her son's affair, but in disbelief that Emily dared to raise her voice. "You should be grateful," she spat. "Vanessa is at least from a family that understands legacy." Emily turned, stunned. "So you knew?" she asked. Eleanor didn't flinch. Nate, cornered by his shame and his mother's approval of his sin, exploded. "Maybe this house was never meant for you." And with those words, the walls Emily once tried to call home collapsed. Hours later, Lucas returned to find his mother packing bags in silence. Jules tried to intervene, whispering, "Let it cool down," but Emily knew the heat wasn't temporary, it was embedded in the walls, in the silence, in the betrayal that now had a name. Nate didn't stop her. He didn't reach for Lucas. Eleanor stood with folded arms at the top of the staircase, victorious in her stillness. With nothing but a worn duffel bag and her toolkit, Emily walked out of the Rivers mansion holding Lucas's hand. She didn't cry until they reached the sidewalk. And even then, the tears were silent, angry, broken, but not defeated. She whispered to Lucas, "This isn't the end, baby. It's a bend." And as she flagged down a cab with the last $20 in her purse, she looked back once, not at the man she married, but at the house that mistook her kindness for weakness. She promised herself then, they would regret this. Carlos opened the door, still wiping oil from his hands, the smell of gasoline and steel clinging to his overalls as Emily stood in the rain-soaked doorway with Lucas pressed against her hip. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at her bruised spirit and the desperation in her soaked clothes. Then he stepped aside and pulled them in without asking a single question. His wife, Savannah, sharp-tongued and warm-hearted, rushed to prepare hot cocoa and fresh towels. They cleared out their daughter's old room, and for the first time in weeks, Emily slept without the weight of judgment pressing down her chest. She didn't tell them everything the first night, only that she and Nate had parted. But Savannah, ever intuitive, saw through her broken smiles. "You don't owe anyone silence," she said the next morning, placing her hand on Emily's. "You owe yourself a beginning." And for the first time since leaving the Rivers estate, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe she could begin again. Days turned into weeks, and Emily, despite her bruised pride, refused to wallow. She pulled out her old tools and began sewing again on Carlos's back porch, this time under string lights and laughter instead of chandeliers and scrutiny. Carlos introduced her to the owner of Nico's Diner, who needed new leather upholstery for their booths. Emily impressed them not just with her craft, but with her punctuality, her humility, and her eye for detail. She began getting referrals from other small restaurants and delivery shops needing repairs. At night, she helped Lucas with homework and taught him to cut fabric edges for fun. Each day became its own small triumph. She even managed to turn Carlos's garage into a temporary workspace. Savannah surprised her by painting a small wooden sign, "Made by M." Emily cried when she saw it, not because it was grand, but because someone believed in her again. That belief was the thread she needed to start stitching her life back together. Meanwhile, across the city, Nate and Vanessa announced their engagement with a tasteless splash in a lifestyle magazine, Power Couple to Watch, Rivers and Hale set to build an empire together. Vanessa had moved into the mansion within weeks, her heels clicking on the marble floors like victory. She changed the curtains, repainted the walls, even suggested Eleanor redecorate the dining hall to feel less outdated. Eleanor smiled, but the cold in her eyes didn't thaw. For all her earlier disdain for Emily, she hadn't anticipated Vanessa's speed and control. Nate, on the other hand, buried himself in work and let her run the home. He didn't check in on Lucas. He didn't ask Jules how Emily was doing. He just shut it out. But guilt has a strange rhythm, it returns at night when the world goes quiet. And in those silent hours, Nate found himself remembering things he never thought mattered, Emily's laugh when she burned rice, Lucas dancing to radio jingles, and the haunting sound of the front door when it finally closed behind them. The absence of Emily in the Rivers household was like an echo that refused to die. At first, Vanessa celebrated the vacuum she created, moving through the halls like a queen, rearranging furniture, firing longtime staff, and replacing fresh flowers with artificial ones because no one has time for real anymore. Eleanor, who initially tolerated Vanessa, soon found herself at odds with the woman's aggressive ambition. Vanessa mocked the antique tea sets, called the family chef boring, and insisted that Eleanor stop wearing funeral dresses every day. Nate noticed the tension but did little to intervene. His days were consumed by board meetings and property reviews. His nights were shared with a woman who brought him no peace. There was no laughter at the dinner table, no little feet running through the hallway. Eleanor grew quieter, retreating into herself. She missed Lucas, though she would never say it aloud, and caught herself reaching for Emily's herbal teas only to remember they were long gone. Nate tried to drown the unease with work, but even that began to falter. His pitches became robotic, his leadership uninspired. Clients noticed. Investors grew impatient. And the weight of Vanessa's influence over both his personal and professional decisions began to cloud his judgment. At one board meeting, he incorrectly cited figures Emily used to double-check for him on late nights. His assistant looked puzzled. Vanessa shrugged. "He's just tired," she said, brushing it off. But deep down, Nate wasn't tired, he was hollow. And the more he tried to fill the void with Vanessa's forced smiles and strategic compliments, the more he realized he had mistaken gloss for gold. Meanwhile, Eleanor's health subtly declined. Jules noticed her trembling hands and fading appetite. When she suggested a hospital visit, Eleanor snapped, "Don't fuss. I'm not a child." But her reflection in the mirror told a different story. Her home had become unfamiliar, colder even than before. And somewhere in the silence, regret began its slow crawl. Far away, Emily's world bloomed with purpose. She was no longer surviving, she was rebuilding. Her work with Nico's Diner expanded after customers started asking about her custom stools and apron designs. One day, the boutique hotel 2 blocks down asked if she could reupholster their vintage lounge sets. Emily poured herself into the project, hand-stitched every seam, and delivered it on time with Lucas by her side. The manager was so impressed, he offered her a permanent contract for all seasonal redesigns. She opened a business account under Made by M and registered it as a small business. Her mornings became a dance of deadlines and deliveries, and her evenings were filled with soft laughter, stories, and hope. She tucked away the pain of her past, but not forgotten it. It lived in her drive. Every stitch she sewed whispered, "They tried to erase me." And every client's satisfaction answered back, "But you rose instead." Lucas stood on stage with shaky hands, wearing a paper crown made of recycled cardboard and a cape stitched from an old curtain Emily had hemmed. It was Hero Day at Ridgeview Elementary, and each student had to present someone they admired. Most chose superheroes, presidents, or athletes. Lucas stood proudly and said, "My hero is my mom, because she builds things, fixes things, and never gives up." Emily, sitting among other parents in the back row, covered her mouth as her eyes flooded. For a boy who had once stopped speaking after the divorce, his words cut through every wound and stitched them back with pride. The auditorium erupted in applause. After the event, a woman in a navy blue pantsuit approached Emily and introduced herself as Melissa Dorian, a creative director for a high-end footwear catalog. She had recently purchased one of Emily's reupholstered chairs at the hotel and had been searching for the woman behind the craftsmanship ever since. Melissa was more than impressed, she was invested. She offered Emily a collaborative opportunity to design a signature line of handmade children's shoes for their holiday campaign. The deal wasn't massive in numbers, but it was monumental in reach. Emily returned home that evening shaking, not from fear, but from disbelief. She pulled Lucas into her lap and told him, "You gave Mommy wings today." Over dinner, Carlos and Savannah celebrated the news like it was their own. Savannah insisted they throw a backyard cookout to honor her. It wasn't champagne and designer gowns, but it was joy. And it was real. Meanwhile, across town, Jules did something she had never done before. She visited Emily. She arrived in a cab, looking over her shoulder, and handed Emily a folded sheet of paper. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said. "But you deserve to know." It was Eleanor's new medication list, longer than it should have been, with 2 prescriptions missing entirely. They're not taking care of her, Jules whispered. Emily stared at the paper in silence, her hands tightening. She hadn't heard from or about Eleanor since the day she left, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. But something in Jules's eyes, desperation, perhaps, cut through her anger. Jules explained that Eleanor had grown weaker, barely left her room, and Vanessa rarely visited her unless it was to complain about the household. Nate had grown colder, barely present, and often didn't notice Eleanor's episodes. Emily asked why Jules was telling her this. The woman took a breath and replied, "Because you were the only light in that house." And they snuffed it out. Emily didn't respond. That night, she sat at her sewing machine with Lucas curled beside her and the prescription list tucked beneath a sketch pad. She had no plans to return. But the whisper of hope that maybe she could still choose grace over anger lingered quietly. Something was changing, again. But this time, Emily would control the direction. The empire Nate once held with steel-like grip had started to fray around the edges. Projects were delayed, clients grew impatient, and investors were quietly pulling out. He chalked it up to market volatility, but deep inside, he knew it wasn't numbers that had shifted, it was him. Vanessa, now firmly installed in the Rivers mansion, had her own agenda. She began pressuring Nate into riskier ventures, high-yield real estate flips, low-regulation developments in fragile neighborhoods, and shady partnerships masked with luxurious brochures. Her charm that once thrilled him had evolved into manipulation, masked threats layered in velvet smiles. When he hesitated on a deal that required bending zoning laws, she scoffed, maybe Emily was right. You're not built for legacy, just convenience. The insult lingered. Nate stared at himself in the mirror that night and saw a man unrecognizable, his jaw clenched, his eyes hollow, and a gnawing hollowness wrapped around his once proud posture. The guilt had calcified. And now, it was caving him in. At home, Eleanor's silence had transformed into physical frailty. She no longer attended brunches or hosted charity events. Her elegant dresses hung untouched in her wardrobe, replaced by hospital gowns and heavy blankets. Vanessa made no effort to hide her disinterest in the aging matriarch. She often skipped meals and only checked in to comment on inheritance-related documents. Eleanor once attempted to speak during a dinner, struggling to lift a fork, but Vanessa cut her off mid-sentence with, "You'll rest better when you stop overexerting your opinion." Nate barely looked up. It was Jules who fed her, Jules who reminded her to take her remaining medication, Jules who tucked her in at night. The Rivers estate, once rigid with dignity, now reeked of cold transactions and unloved history. Nate began having silent panic attacks in the study, holding his chest when no one watched, afraid to admit weakness. He started staying longer at work, not to succeed, but to escape. The mansion no longer felt like home. On a cold Thursday evening, Eleanor and Vanessa had their first open confrontation. Eleanor, shaking and clutching her walking stick, accused Vanessa of switching her medication and withholding assistance. Vanessa laughed. "You're lucky I haven't packed you off to a care home already," she spat. The word struck Eleanor like ice. She called for Nate that night, breathless and pale, but he didn't come. Jules found her sobbing in the hallway. That same night, Nate scrolled through his phone while alone in his car outside a closed bar. A video had gone viral, Emily's new children's shoe collection featured on a lifestyle segment. Her name, her story, her strength. The host called her a rising star in American handmade leather fashion. Nate watched in silence, tears threatening but never falling. He missed her. Missed Lucas. Missed peace. But the curtains had already begun to fall, and he was the one who had drawn them shut. Carlos sat across from Emily in a buzzing downtown cafe, a folder spread between them, his fingers tapping the table as he explained the opportunity. A longtime customer of his garage, Elliot Brax, happened to be a mid-level investor in boutique retail and had taken a special interest in Emily's rise. After reviewing her designs, her story, and the social traction of her viral feature, Elliot offered to fund a full-scale launch of her brand under one condition: it had to remain hers. "He doesn't want to own you," Carlos said, smiling. "He wants to help you fly." Emily was overwhelmed. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the paperwork, seeing phrases like independent ownership, exclusive rights, and percentage royalties. It was more than validation, it was freedom. She could hire women like her, mothers with calloused palms and silenced dreams. She could create something lasting. For the first time in years, she felt not rescued, but empowered. Emily's first act was to rent a modest studio space in a former art loft, bright, open, with brick walls and rustic charm. She painted it warm beige, lined it with hanging tools and leather rolls, and hung Lucas's old superhero drawing on the entrance wall. "This is our headquarters," she told him, beaming. Word spread fast. Former customers began flooding her inbox. One woman, who had been laid off from a luxury retail job, joined her team. Another, a mother of twins, offered logistics help. By the end of the month, Emily had 4 part-time artisans and 2 interns. She named the brand Stitched and Strong. Each pair of shoes had the names of the women who crafted them burned into the soles, a tribute to their journeys. But amid her rising joy, an unexpected face arrived, Jada, Vanessa's former maid. Let go after speaking up about Eleanor's mistreatment, Jada came seeking a job, carrying nothing but a broken resume and hope. Emily didn't hesitate. "You're hired," she said. "We rebuild here." Word of Emily's growing influence eventually circled back to Vanessa, and she didn't take it well. At first, it was disbelief. Then jealousy. Then rage. She called her attorney and demanded they send a cease and desist letter to Emily, accusing her of using Rivers' personal connections and media ties to gain publicity. When the letter arrived, Emily read it with calm resolve and passed it to Elliot. "We'll take care of this," he assured her, unfazed. But Emily wasn't afraid. She had built this with sweat, not favors. Still, the intimidation tactics reminded her that the ghosts of her past weren't done with her yet. That night, as she sat sewing under golden lamplight, Lucas asleep beside her, Emily whispered to herself, "Let them come." Because this time, she was no longer a guest in someone else's mansion, she was a woman building her own kingdom from the ashes of heartbreak. And this kingdom wouldn't fall without a fight. Vanessa insisted on a lavish engagement celebration, a public spectacle to cement her dominance not only over Nate, but over the narrative she had long orchestrated behind closed doors. Held at the sprawling ballroom of the Carlton Regency Hotel, the affair was a grotesque blend of glitter and pretense. Marble floors shimmered under crystal chandeliers, and uniformed waiters passed hors d'oeuvres to socialites and politicians who wore smiles as thin as the champagne flutes in their hands. Nate, wearing a tailored tuxedo and an expression that seemed permanently frozen between obligation and regret, stood by Vanessa's side as guests congratulated them with hollow praise. Eleanor, escorted in by Jules, sat quietly in a corner, her presence barely acknowledged by the woman who was supposed to be her future daughter-in-law. She looked pale, almost translucent in the artificial light, and her eyes searched the crowd like a prisoner seeking an open door. Nate noticed, but he said nothing. Vanessa raised her glass and began her carefully rehearsed toast. "To new beginnings," she said with a dazzling smile, her voice echoing through the hall. "And to partnerships that build not just homes, but empires." The room applauded, but the moment was abruptly sliced apart by a loud ping from the central display screen. The tech manager, confused, tried to override the interruption, but it was too late. A video began to play. The screen flickered, then showed Vanessa seated at a hair salon, laughing with another woman. "Please," she scoffed in the recording, "Nate's just a stepping stone. Once I get my stake in his holdings, I'll be out of that suffocating mansion and into my real plan." The room went silent. A few gasps, some murmured whispers. Vanessa's smile dropped like shattered glass. Nate stared at the screen in stunned silence, his breath caught halfway between disbelief and betrayal. Eleanor's lips curled faintly, not into joy, but justice. In a matter of seconds, the room turned. The guests who had once clinked glasses with Vanessa now stared at her like a scandal unmasked. Nate didn't say a word, he simply turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving her frozen at the podium. Cameras caught every expression, and within minutes, the video had gone viral online. Vanessa chased after him, grabbing his arm in the hallway, begging him to believe it was taken out of context. But Nate looked through her, his voice calm but final. "You were never building a life, you were calculating a conquest." Vanessa slapped him in desperation, but security escorted her back inside, ending the night in chaos. Nate didn't return to the party. Instead, he drove aimlessly until he parked outside the old neighborhood where Emily's workshop once stood. He didn't knock. He didn't call. He just sat in his car, hands on the steering wheel, as the truth that had always been there finally made itself undeniable. Nate hadn't slept in 2 days. The engagement fiasco had become a media circus, with blogs dissecting Vanessa's every word from the leaked video. Investors pulled out, press demanded answers, and his firm, once untouchable, was now under scrutiny. But beyond the professional carnage, what consumed Nate most was the quiet awareness that he had lost far more than status. Sitting outside Emily's workshop late into the night, he watched the lights flicker inside. He didn't have the courage to knock. He didn't know if he deserved to. But watching her interact with her staff, laughing, working, guiding, he saw something purer that couldn't be replicated with chandeliers or designer gowns. She had built something from pain. Something lasting. He was still sitting in his car the next morning when Jules called him in a panic. Eleanor had fallen, badly. Vanessa refused to call an ambulance. Nate dropped the phone before she finished the sentence and tore down the highway like a man already too late. When Nate arrived, the mansion felt like a crime scene. The front door was ajar, and Jules met him with tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's in her room," she sobbed. She hit her head. "She was calling for you." Nate sprinted up the staircase, 2 steps at a time, and found his mother slumped beside the bed, her nightgown stained with blood and pills scattered across the floor. And standing above her, with a shoe in hand and eyes wide in fury, was Vanessa. She was mid-shout when Nate burst in, her words, "You ungrateful old hag," still ringing. For a moment, time stilled. Nate took in the scene, the bruise forming on Eleanor's cheek, the fear in Jules' eyes, the broken dignity in the woman who once ruled his world. Vanessa dropped the shoe, suddenly aware of how far she'd gone. "She provoked me," she yelled, stepping back. Nate didn't respond. He called the police. And when Vanessa reached for him, pleading, he backed away like she was fire. The officers arrived within 10 minutes. Nate gave his statement coldly, methodically, as Vanessa screamed and thrashed while being escorted out. "She framed me. You know what she's like." But Nate no longer heard her. His mind was locked on Eleanor's slow breaths as she was carried out on a stretcher. At the hospital, the diagnosis wasn't fatal, but it was serious, a concussion, a sprained wrist, and signs of long-term neglect. Nate sat beside her, holding her frail hand as she whispered hoarsely, "She was never family." But Emily tried. And that single sentence broke him. The weight of every decision, every betrayal, every moment he let manipulation win over love, fell like an avalanche. He stepped outside into the cold night air and made one final decision. If redemption was possible, it wouldn't come through apologies. It would come through actions. And it would begin not at the Rivers mansion, but at a workshop built by a woman he never truly deserved. The morning after Vanessa's arrest, silence hung in the Rivers mansion like fog in a graveyard. Nate stood in the hallway outside his mother's now empty room, staring at her unmade bed, haunted by everything he'd ignored. The once glamorous house now felt like a decaying monument to everything he'd lost. Vanessa had been denied bail pending assault charges, and news of her violence spread like wildfire through media outlets and boardrooms alike. His firm placed him on immediate leave for optics, and sponsors began withdrawing from all projects linked to his name. Nate didn't resist. For the first time, he welcomed the collapse. He spent hours reviewing old photos, Emily laughing barefoot in the garden with Lucas, their first apartment with its peeling wallpaper, the tiny red toolbox she used to fix broken stools. Every memory reminded him that love wasn't built in marble mansions or sealed with elite handshakes. It was built in sweat, sacrifice, and truth. He hadn't planned to call Emily. He didn't feel entitled to her time. But something inside him, desperation, guilt, perhaps a trace of hope, pushed him to dial her number. She didn't answer the first time. Or the second. He left a message. Just one. She's in the hospital. I failed her. I failed you. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I just wanted you to know the truth. He hung up and didn't expect a response. But later that evening, just as the hospital nurse was helping Eleanor sit up for dinner, the door opened, and in walked Emily. She didn't speak at first. She simply looked around the room, her eyes landing softly on Eleanor's pale face. You look smaller, she finally said, her voice low. And older. Eleanor nodded, her voice thin. Because I am. And for what it's worth. I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't enough. But it was real. Emily sat beside her, not as a daughter-in-law, but as a woman who still believed dignity could rise from the ashes. Nate stood in the doorway, watching the two women he had failed share a moment of painful, overdue grace. He didn't dare interrupt. He felt like a man peering into a life he once had the chance to protect but squandered. When Emily finally turned to him, there was no smile. Only calm resolve. I didn't come back for you, she said. I came because I'm still human. Nate nodded, accepting the boundary like a verdict. I know, he whispered. But thank you. Emily didn't linger. She walked past him, pausing just long enough to say, Lucas is doing great, by the way. He doesn't ask about you anymore. The words cut deeper than she intended, but they were true. Nate closed his eyes as she walked away, the scent of leather and lavender trailing behind her like a memory he could never reclaim. That night, for the first time in years, he cried without hiding. And no one was there to comfort him. Nate returned to the mansion that now echoed with absence. Eleanor had been transferred to an assisted care facility, by her own request, and Jules had resigned, claiming she had done her time in a house that forgot how to love. Left alone, Nate wandered through each room, touching surfaces that once bustled with life, now reduced to cold silence. The portraits of past Rivers men no longer inspired pride, they judged him. Every inch of the estate whispered a truth he couldn't ignore: power without love was just loneliness dressed in gold. Nate began liquidating his assets. He stepped down from his board seat at Halston and Bryce. Sold 3 properties. Closed the mansion's ballroom and converted Eleanor's master suite into a rehabilitation donation center. His name still meant something, but now, he wanted it to mean something good. He started volunteering quietly, showing up to community housing projects, not with cameras this time, but with work gloves and humility. Meanwhile, Emily was unveiling her biggest milestone yet. After months of collaboration, marketing, and labor, Stitched and Strong officially opened its flagship storefront, nestled between a bookstore and a family-run cafe in the heart of downtown. The event wasn't a flashy launch party but a block-wide celebration filled with real people, live music, food trucks, and rows of custom shoes labeled with the names of the women who had made them. Lucas helped cut the ribbon, his grin wider than the banner behind him. Melissa Dorian brought reporters. Carlos gave a tear-jerking speech. Savannah cried into a plate of suya tacos. Emily stood in the middle of it all, radiant, whole, and unshakable. A few of the investors who had once doubted her came to witness what they now called the most inspiring turnaround they'd ever seen. And yet, Emily didn't do it for applause. She did it to prove something to the little girl she used to be, the one who once cried over a broken sewing needle and still got up to try again. A week later, Nate stood at the back of a school auditorium, unnoticed, as Lucas stepped on stage for the regional science fair. He presented his project, a design for shoes that converted kinetic energy into emergency lighting. I got the idea from my mom, he said proudly. She's a shoemaker, but she's also an inventor. She takes things that are worn out and turns them into something powerful. The applause was thunderous. Nate didn't approach them afterward. He simply left a small envelope with the event coordinator. Inside was a college bond for Lucas, unsigned, anonymous, no strings attached. He walked away from the school that day feeling both full and empty. Redemption, he realized, wasn't owed, it was chosen. And if Emily never forgave him, he would still try to earn it, piece by piece. As he disappeared into the crowd, Emily opened the envelope, recognized the handwriting, and said nothing. She simply smiled faintly and whispered, "Good. Let him keep trying." The grand opening of Emily's second workshop space, located just 3 blocks from the original, marked more than business growth. It symbolized survival reborn as legacy. The new facility wasn't just for shoe production. It housed classrooms, community sewing stations, and even a children's playroom named after Lucas. Stitched and Strong had become more than a brand, it was a movement. Orders were now streaming in internationally, and Emily had just signed a deal to collaborate on orthopedic designs for children with disabilities. She walked through the hall that morning, her hand brushing against the nameplates of her team, each one a woman who once thought life had discarded her. They hadn't just been hired. They had been seen. Empowered. Reborn. Carlos now handled logistics full-time, Savannah ran workshops on budgeting for single mothers, and Lucas, her little hero, was writing a children's book called The Boy with the Shoemaking Mom. For Emily, this was no comeback. This was a coronation. Across town, Nate sat in a modest one-bedroom apartment overlooking a quiet park, far from the penthouse suites and glass towers he once ruled. He volunteered twice a week now, tutoring underprivileged kids in math and helping elderly veterans navigate housing applications. He had sold the Rivers mansion months ago and donated most of the earnings to the local rehabilitation center in Eleanor's name. She now lived in a small, peaceful home surrounded by flowers and nurses who treated her with dignity. They spoke often, less about the past and more about healing. Nate hadn't seen Emily since the science fair, and he didn't expect to. But he kept a photo of Lucas's project on his nightstand, beside a worn shoebox with the initials EW burned into the leather. His world was quieter now, smaller, perhaps, but truer. And for the first time in his adult life, he was becoming the kind of man he wished he'd been when it mattered most. One afternoon, as Emily packed the last box of her custom mother and son limited edition line, she received a handwritten card from a customer in Ohio. "Thank you for reminding me that even broken things can walk again," it read. She placed the card on her shelf, beside a framed picture of Lucas in his superhero cape. Then she paused, exhaled, and walked outside to where her staff was setting up for the company's first community fair. There were balloons, laughter, local artists performing, and rows of booths run by the very women she had once trained. The world no longer felt like a war. It felt like a garden. And in that garden, Emily had bloomed. She turned to Lucas, now 10 and taller, who ran toward her with a beaming smile. "Mom, they sold out of our shoes again," he shouted. She pulled him into a hug, smiled through joyful tears, and whispered, "Good. Let's make more." The end.